Hello and welcome to our third episode of the SaaSOps show. I'm Justine and this is Brian. Brian, I'm really enjoying your background today. It looks like you've finally entered the world of The Shining.
Yep, I am really leaning in hard to this isolation theme that we've got going on, and I'm starting to see things, weird things happening.
Well, don't work too
twins. Hard. Yeah. All work, no play.
Red rum.
So we are here not to talk about murderous ghosts and a haunted hotel, but rather we're here to talk about security incident response simulations and workflows with our illustrious Chief Information Security Officer, Carlos Batista. He's the CISO of BetterCloud, and he's going to tell us all about how we stay safe and practice good practices.
Well, thank you, Brian. So I'm BetterCloud CISO, and hopefully a nice guy as well. Just a little bit about me. I like playing tennis. Obviously not playing much right now, but I can't wait to get out there one day and hopefully hit the ball again. So if any of you in the Atlanta area like tennis as well, feel free to find me on LinkedIn or anywhere, and we'll happy to get out there sometime. But yeah, Brian's right that today's topic today is incident response simulations and workflows. Happy to talk a little bit about that. In terms of like why we do a simulation. So just kind of break down what that means. Essentially, what we're trying to do here at BetterCloud is kind of exercise the business a little bit. We don't ever want the company to ever suffer a major data security incident or, heaven forbid, a breach. But if we did, we'd certainly want to ensure the business was prepared as much as possible. And we don't want us, the technology teams, the business teams, making decisions under the fog of war for the first time ever, like not even thinking about some of the different elements or aspects of how we might communicate with our customers, or who would talk to law enforcement, and what will they say? Who's authorized to talk to the press? What would we tell our teammates? How do we do forensics? How do we recover our environment? Having those kind of conversations for the first time during the middle of a real breach is a bad place to be. And so we don't ever want to be in that situation. So we have, over the past year, created a series of simulations that essentially replicate or try to replicate as much as possible what it would be like if BetterCloud were to go through such an event, and sort of simulating the process of learning about a breach either from a customer or from the FBI or another federal agency or potentially internally, and then sort of like wargaming out how might we respond, especially when they're getting thrown different elements or new information that might make that response a little bit more difficult. And so the idea is to essentially simulate that as much as possible from a business perspective and a technology one. And so if that makes sense, that's kind of why we do it today, just to make sure that we don't ever have to ask some very basic questions like who talks to the press for the very first time in the event of something like that.
Totally. Yeah. Can you break down for us a little bit the difference between what a business security incident simulation is like and what a technical one is like, and what you've seen happen in the ones we've run through recently?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because the first couple of these that we did were really focused on what I consider the business side of the response, which is essentially locking David, our CEO, along with every other top level executive and much of the senior leadership in a room for a whole afternoon, like 3-4 hours, and walking through all of the elements of how we would deal with our customers, how we would deal with our technology partners that we've set up partnerships in business and do business with, how we would respond internally, like what would we tell our teammates, and what would be the rules of the road for how we would actually communicate with each other during an incident. So that's sort of the business side aspect of this in terms of how we would think about that. Like who would look at our contracts to determine, which customer, like how do we respond, in a way that contractually meets our requirements while also doing the right thing from a customer experience perspective. And so that's sort of like the business side aspects of the incident response. There's also a very technical side. And so we've ensured that we've sort of like walked through and simulated what that might look like. So we've brought, this is another like 3 to 4 hour, like lock a bunch of people in the room, but the audience here is a little bit different. It's the architectural and technology engineering leadership and their staffs, along with my security team, to kind of walk through how would we do things like contain the incident? How do we limit the damage as much as possible once we learn about it? How do we do basic things like digital forensics? How do we create like machine images, like forensically preserved machine images of specific servers that might have been impacted, or how do we create like copies of log files that we can ship to a external incident response provider to the extent that we've brought one on board? How do we get the bad guys out of our environment once we figured out how they got in? And how do we bring back BetterCloud to a known good state prior to the incident occurring? And so there's a very different set of things that we have to try to figure out in both types of exercises. And it's important to test both, because you can't do a good incident response without having both of those elements figured out, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, humans have to exercise and practice to stay in shape, and businesses do too, right? I mean, I've definitely been exercising at home.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, like the first time we did it, just like any business, I've done this several times in several different companies, and I've never been a part of this where the first one goes really well. They just don't. It's like getting out there and playing a sport for the first time. Like, I don't care how much you know about that sport. The first time you get out there to swing a bat or swing a golf club or throw a football or kick a soccer, you're just not going to do well out there the first time. The idea is to exercise, like you mentioned, Brian, and build up some practice, some muscle memory, so that if you actually do have to play the game for real, like you've done it a few times in a safe environment.
And what are some of the biggest takeaways you get from doing these types of simulations? And like, how is what BetterCloud's doing maybe different from either what other companies are doing or what you've seen in the past at previous roles?
I mean, if I had to think about it, probably what jumps out at me is probably the biggest thing that jumps out at me at doing this at BetterCloud that's a little bit different, I would say, is the customer communication element. BetterCloud prides itself in how we manage and deal and support and help our customers on a day-to-day basis. And so the amount of energy and thought that we've put into the customer side of the response, being very thoughtful and intentional about how we would communicate with them, who would actually author these messages and write them, and where would they who would send them out, what would they say. We're very, very specific and intentional about that, much more so than any other company that I've been a part of. And that's just a product of the commitment that BetterCloud, I think, has made to, or tries to make to, its customers every single day. Probably the other thing that jumps out at me is, I mean, we're a cloud native business. I mean, BetterCloud was formed in the cloud. We don't have on-prem technology and assets the way that most companies do. And so it makes things like incident response in the cloud, particularly around the digital forensic side, interesting. And in some ways it's easier because you can instrument a lot of the log and data collection through infrastructure as code, through other automation and other means. But the flip side of that is that being in the cloud can make it a little bit more difficult. There are certain elements of using managed services and solutions like AWS or Azure or GCP that can make monitoring, visibility, and log collection a little bit more challenging. And so that's probably the sort of like the flip side or the other side of the coin with that I think makes incident response planning at a company like BetterCloud or any cloud native business a little bit more interesting and in some ways easier, in some ways more challenging than your typical traditional on-prem business.
One component of what we like to think that we are including in our security incident response planning is we've actually created a workflow that we can run when these things occur. So Carlos, I would love to hear from you what you were trying to accomplish with that workflow and how it helps enhance any wins that we get from these security simulations or from that planning process.
Yeah, it's something that we wanted to create, I would say, fairly early on. I mean, we've got a platform that helps us instrument a lot of things in solutions like G Suite and Slack. And so one of the things that was sort of important to us early on is, like, heaven forbid, we identify a significant security incident and I have to pull the lever on, you know, like, hey, like this, a breach has occurred. We have to activate our cyber incident response plan. One of the things that's going to take up a lot of like unnecessary time early on is I've got to notify people. I've got to notify our executive team. I've got to notify our broader corporate incident response team, which includes people across our business within sales and our success team, within our finance and legal teams, within our engineering and architecture, security teams, both of you and IT, and, you know, create Slack channels that articulate how the technical teams will respond versus how the business teams will respond, and provide rules of engagement for how people should communicate in those channels. That's time. It takes time to kind of build and create, and it's time that, frankly, I just don't have. I don't think most people just don't have or don't want to have to spend during a significant event like that. So we elected to use our own platform to help automate the creation of that. By using our platform, Better Cloud, to create we basically created an on-demand workflow that if I ever felt the need to activate the plan, I or someone on my team could literally go into our platform and run that workflow. And what that workflow will do is essentially create a pair of Slack channels and then add the entire corporate incident response team to one or both of those Slack channels, thereby notifying them that a major security incident has taken place, so that we can all get together and understand how we're going to respond to this thing, while also providing them pinned messages or descriptions in those Slack channels as what those Slack channels are for, and what the rules of the road are for how to communicate in those Slack channels. Because one of the things that you don't want to do, electronically speaking, you know, and this is just kind of legalese, but it is what it is like you need to be very careful and intentional about what you say within a Slack channel during a security incident or response event. So you want to make sure that you're speaking on the facts versus hyperbole, for example. So we are pinning messages within each of those Slack channels, within the description of those channels, to describe what they're for, so that the rules of the road are followed as much as we can help.
And we've got our incident response workflow up here. So do you want to take a look at it with me? We can walk through it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, doing a screen share.
Doing it.
There we go. So this is our security incident response workflow version 1. So as Carlos mentioned, this is an on-demand workflow. It's not conditioned off of any triggers. You can just say, I want to run this, and it'll go through the process. You mentioned the first step is we create a couple of Slack channels. Those Slack channels operate as war rooms, and they cover both the business side of things and the technical incident side of things. And so we can see here in steps 1 and 2, we create 2 different channels, and we say business incident response, the technical incident response, and we actually we append the date and time so that those channels are unique. So every time we create or run this incident response workflow, it's a unique Slack channel that gets created. And then very importantly, we add Carlos to these Slack channels. Can't run an incident response without having the CISO on board. And we also post, so we execute a webhook that posts into a separate Slack channel saying a security incident's been triggered, and you can head over to these channels. After that, we do quite a few things that are little, but take up a lot of time if you're in the middle of an actual incident, which is we unhide a security support email address that people can contact with information and use to communicate with each other. And then we add a number of people. You mentioned there's a team of people that are involved in the event of a data breach or something like that. We add all of those people into these channels. Notably in the workflow, you can reference a channel that you have created as an earlier step in the workflow. So that's why it'll say action 1 channel. And then at the very bottom down here, we set the purpose of the channel. So you mentioned too that, you want to be setting the guidelines for what types of discussions happen in that channel. You don't want to be speculative, and you want to keep those channels separate. So One is to talk about logistics, what's happening, when it's happening, but not what caused the breach or not what caused the incident. And then the second channel is to only talk about the technical aspects, how to mitigate what's happening. And it's not about speculating about what causes it and things like that. Is there anything else that you add for this?
So no, I think that's a great overview, and Brian, like I have you to thank for helping us create this workflow. Yeah, like it's like as Brian, as you mentioned, it's V1 for us. Yeah, when I think about V2, you know, the other element that I'd love to see this workflow have is, you know, could we leverage our Zoom integration, for example, to create a couple of standing Zoom rooms, both for the technical incident response team as well as the business IR team, so that both teams have a war room that they can jump in. And, you know, bonus points if we could somehow add that Zoom room to like pinned into the the Slack channel, but that's maybe like a V2.5 or something like that. But essentially something that kind of, again, just sort of instruments these sort of manual tasks that I or my team, I certainly don't have to worry about dealing with early on during an event. So if there's a way that we can create Zoom rooms to sort of block these like video conference congregation area, meeting areas out, that would certainly make this workflow even more valuable to me and the security team in the event, heaven forbid, we ever had to use it.
Yeah, so you're saying I've got some work to do. Okay, got it.
Sure, why not? Yeah, the other thing that so I mean, Brian, you scrolled through a list of names, you know, blurred out and all, but it'd be sweet if we could also, rather than relying on static like names and identities to be added to the channel, if we could create a Slack group and maybe just add the Slack group for each of those teams into the channel. That's maybe something worth looking into if that's even possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the wonderful thing about technology is that we can always be iterating and always expanding and building on top of the stuff that we have.
100%.
Technology changes.
Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome. I know a lot of our viewers will have tons of takeaways from this.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me, gangs.
Yeah, and thank you to Carlos for joining us today. And we will see everyone next time for a surprise topic. It's mostly code for we don't know what we're going to be filming about next time. But don't forget to join us in our Better IT Slack group. Better IT, it's a place where everybody is. All the cool kids are hanging out there.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Cool. Thank you.
See y'all.
Bye.
To the cloud.